Hello, class. Welcome to the lecture of cultures of the world system that we have been discussing. Uh, Today, we'll be focusing on the whole wide world, the rediscovery of political economy, and the importance of political economy as such. One of the core argument Marshall Charlins was putting forward, and in comparison to Eric Wolf, is that how the localized empire actually negotiated or maintained the British Empire's attempt to connect, to get into the territorial and the business relationship with uh, non-colonized world. So that is a very important part we need to figure it out. So two cases are very important. One is Chinese case and one is Hawaiian luxury case. So when the British East India Trading Company established in Canton in 1699, it was met with tight regulations, duties and extortions passed by Chinese merchants, marginalization and at contempt, and above all, a remarkable lack of anything worth selling. So we should remember that British Empire or British East India Company not necessarily always have the easy access to other territories. The British wanted skills, silks, porcelains, and above all tea. So we shouldn't be forgetting it is coming from China, which had become in less than a half century an indispensable necessity of life across class lines. It meant across class differences, and for which they felt it worthwhile to dump British woolness for considerable sustained losses. British manufacturers and merchants of cotton textiles, steel and iron products, ships and equipment were all desperate for new markets and Chinese riches. However, there is a seemingly insurmountable problem. The Chinese were not interested in anything European merchants had to offer. So it is not like mm, European merchants offering something and people, non-European people, are readily prepared for accepting those. So indeed, when envious and ambassadors of George III came offering that they bought as of presents to the Qianlong emperor of the Qing dynasty, keen to establish diplomatic relations and liberalize trade, because liberalized trade is important for British Empire to expand. They were met with a time-honored and mm, dignified indifferences. Not only did the Celestial dynasty not value ingenious articles or have the slightest need for British manufacturers, it had already amassed the wealth of the world, precious things from far, wide, and collected as tribute to the universal power, the Chinese dynasty. And this was not empty rhetoric either. No matter how hard British envoys struggled to portray their offerings as samples of British industrial power, superiority, they were accepted as nothing more than tributes, rare, strange exotica of no real use, and certainly not symbols of superiority. So, within the cultural politics of the two territorial giants, British attempt was quite futile. This was the universal power, the recipient of mandate of heaven, mind it the case of Chinese, whose ascension is accompanied by the reconfiguration of the time, space, and harmony, by the establishment of a new calendar, new measures, and a new musical scale. For barbarians like the British, there was no question of negotiating, only of submitting. So, British culture, British practice is not necessarily accepted as a case of highly valued uh, artifacts. We need to remember that. Thus, as the seat of and condition for civilization, the dynasty would receive tributes as the material mode of integration into civilization. Barbarians' tributes were really objectifications of the emperor's civilizing powers. The more alien and bizarre, the more they stay signaled the inclusivity and reach of imperial virtue. Trade with the British was thus tribute, a boon granted to the barbarians. From the Chinese perspective, of course, the only thing the Chinese really accepted was silver coin, a reality certainly not appreciated by the mercantilist British crown. Yet there was no other way. The thirst for tea, also culturally mediated, as I mentioned earlier, was insatiable. For the 300 years, Chinese become the tomb for European silver, from which none ever returned. You want tea, you have to give silver. So you can see there is a strong sense of negotiation and power between the two giants. Of course, the rivers of silver flowing into China were not really European. Thus, Chinese imperial conceptions of value fundamentally shaped the world system, with its effects reverberating across the world in the South American mines and thus in the African kingdoms, from where the enslaved miners would first be captured. Indeed, it was not until the British were able to use the illegal trade in Indian opium, violently imposed on Chinese through the Opium Wars of 1839, what they were able to circumvent the necessity of silver. However, in contrast to that, unlike the celestial emperor of China, the Hawaiian royalty of the Sandwich Islands could not get enough of European goods. Far from unruly barbarians, to them these foreigners had come from the sky, the celestial homeland of the gods and sacred chiefs. Both European commodities and identities were taken as a signs of divine benefits and mystic bestowals. Hence, the apparent prostration that greeted Captain Cook's landing and the desire to take up the names and habits of European leaders. European commodities and identities become quickly appropriated by the Hawaiian kings for their own hegemonic project in a competition for celestial powers. So you can see, comparing to the Chinese emperor, the Hawaiian case is quite the opposite. For their idea of expansion of power, they treated British goods as a added value to expand their celestial homeland and the gods and sacred chiefs, to acquire as much as more British things they are gonna get, the more powerful they will become. So, however, unlike the universal power, members of Hawaiian royalty were competitors for kingship. You should remember that. For Chinese case, that was chosen, and it is hereditary, clan based, lineage based. Traditionally, such competitions took to the forms of strategic marriages with noble women and violent sacrifice of adversaries. The indigenous theory of sovereignty was encoded in myth and enacted in rituals. The theory of mm, uh, usurpation by the upstart warrior, a stranger who seizes the god king's sacred wife, thus become powerful. A long history of intermarriages, however, ensured that any contender to trace their lineage one way or another. Genealogy itself was the point of contestation and not a guarantor of power. That was how I was indicating. Other ways to claim distinctions were thus crucial, which is precisely where the divine bestowals of Western commerce came in. So it is crucial that you should remember that not every culture, not every system, empire, or Hawaiian Empire or Chinese Empire took the British bait or British way of things in a similar way because their cultural configurations was quite different. From Chinese point of view, it was mm, very much nothing of a nothing that British can offer that is valuable to them because for them the main powerful entity is their emperor. However, in the case of Hawaii, British goods become valuable to get more power from the divine. So, how they are configuring understanding power in their old cultural context is crucial. You should remember that. It's a very vital point. By the 19th century, American merchants cut off from the British West Indies because of the American Revolution had also turned to the far east, capturing the northwest coast Canton fur trade. Yet they did not have the same access to silver or opium that the British did. This is what drove their persistent search across the Pacific for something worth selling to the Chinese. So after British, we should remember that American merchants also tried to have a trade relationship with Chinese because they want something from the Chinese people. These they eventually found in sandalwood, flavored by the Chinese for use as incense in their rapidly growing Buddhist temples. The Hawaiian chiefs were happy to oblige, but they also imposed their own demands. What are the demands? From the Westerners, they demanded an incessant and diverse flow of manufacturers. In return, they established a new unpaid and brutal labor regime dedicated to the exploitation of and trade in nature, the commercial gains from which did not trickle down to the laborers. That is a very important point. The means of production were there, but the mode of production is such where laborers are not getting paid accordingly. Over time, the Hawaiian elite became swallowed up in the race for conspicuous consumptions, racking up commercial debts and triggering discontent, all while American merchants gradually seized more and more Hawaiian land and proletarized the people. The how Marxist approach to understand the labor market mode of production and means of production in the bourgeois society. So Western commerce was not seen as a destroyer but the enricher of the local system, a source for cultural development. So how they negotiated is highly crucial. Thank you. See you in the next one.